listening to Power Plug Radio, home of your throwback jams.
All right, good evening. Happy 2/22/22. I don't know. I got a few chakra friends. I'm gonna find out everything that means for us tonight. But so far it's been a great day. So Grand Tuesday to you all. Welcome to the Political Hour. I am your host, Marielle Summers, coming at you every week, Tuesday nights now, Tuesday evenings at 7 o'clock, to bring you local, state, and national politics, breaking them down and making them relevant for us. But if you caught last episode, you would know that this episode, we are still in Black History Month. And something I did last year, something I try to replicate this year, is this series that kind of just talks about the politics of Black history. And as I sat down, a little earlier to write these things out, I was like, man, there's so many things to cover that I may not get to them. I may not get to them all in this one episode, at least not through the modern times. But you know what they say, Black history is 365, and this is our show, and we can do what we want with it. And so we will continue just with some of these Black history facts maybe throughout the year. We'll kind of make it about local, state, national politics, and just a little tidbit of Black history that you should know to keep it relevant. Got a few things going on at the local level. Mayor Welch is still within his first 100 days. So kind of looking to get his initial initiatives off the ground. And we're still seeing some policy work there, some team building there, and look forward to kind of seeing which direction our mayor takes the city. The state level, our legislators are still in session. They are up there passing some scary pieces of legislation. So keep your eye on that. Remember that this is an election year, big election year for us. We have people like Charlie Crist running for governor, and people like Nikki Fried running for governor, people like Ron DeSantis likely rerunning for governor. And so, the implications of what's happening right now in Tallahassee should tell you that this state is not going to change on its own. It's going to take the goodwill and dedicated efforts of concerned citizens to make it happen. National level, are we going to go to war with the Ukraine? Are we not? I'm still leaning on the side of this is not going to be World War III. I think the brash nature and I guess the outright defiance of Russia is just something that's like culturally, we should be culturally familiar with that. But we've hit them with sanctions today. That was a big headline, but I'm always looking at, what's happening underlying, and this war just wouldn't make sense. It wouldn't make sense at this point in time. And so I don't think it's going to happen. More on our U.S. government, current events next week. We'll kind of get back into that format. But this week, it's still Black History Month. And I really want to talk about some of the richer parts of Black history. I've been listening a lot to this gentleman, Dr. Clinton Smith, who just, I can't think of a more modern Black historian that is able to delve into some of these pockets that are so relevant to today. But some of these things I want to touch on in our show. How are we on time? I appreciate you all tuning in with me this evening. And yeah, man, let's dive right into it. So this whole conversation about Black history, the whole conversation can be summed or kind of equated to the U.S. law. There are so many loopholes and messy language in the U.S. law, whether it comes from the courts or it comes from the legislature, it's an executive order from our president. The law is only as good as its interpretation. That's the beauty of living in a democracy, right? Is it's not according to a select group or it's not by law written into some kind of hierarchy. The king doesn't determine it. It's not a series where the king dies and automatically the child is the heir of the throne, and they now define it something like they have going on in in North Korea. Here in the United States, we have this democracy, and the beauty in this democracy is when it's applied right. When the application is applied right, you have the righteous outcomes of justice. You can achieve the righteous outcomes of justice through the American legal system, through the laws. This can be achieved. And mind you, I'm like a nerd on this stuff, right? So I'm not just saying this off the top of my head or anything like this. I have my degree in political science. I've worked for the African American History Museum. I worked for small private sector African American firms, one dedicated to pushing forward entrepreneurs like Saturday Morning Shop, one dedicated to like diversity and all of the leadership training skills in impact solutions. I've worked for other elected officials, local elected officials, to really grasp how important the law is, how important politics is, how important government is. And what I can tell you, and I've said it on this show before, is no matter what you do, no matter what industry you work in or what sector you find yourself trying to climb in, everything intersects with government. It's gonna intersect with, you're gonna have to follow some type of you're gonna have to know the law. You're gonna have to pay the application fee to get the license. You're gonna have to pay the taxes. I mean, all of these things are derived from our law, from our government. And so as we look at Black history, my favorite way to look at Black history is understanding how our plight as Black people is so entrapped in the law. The law and our plight in this country are so intertwined that you almost can't talk about Black history without talking about the law. So, we know about the landmark cases. We talked about them on the show before. Dred Scott versus Sanford, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus the Board of Education. We've talked about the landmark amendments, how the 13th Amendment to the Constitution did away with slavery and indentured servitude. How the 14th Amendment in this nation defined what a citizen was, and how it instantly gave citizenship to African American men. The 15th Amendment, one of the most vital amendments in these times we live in, outlined that the government cannot infringe on people's right to vote. It gives us the right to vote, the 15th Amendment. So these were all landmark, and I think they're kind of taught in your basic U.S. history classes. But the new laws that are coming through the Florida legislature may even dilute how those things are taught. They may not even be related to race. And so that's one of the scary things. I know we're not going to talk too much about what's happening in Tallahassee this week. We'll let all of the dust settle there. But the law, the House bill that wants to limit the teaching of history in cases where it can be interpreted as uncomfortable. Well, you're going to take, like I said, our history completely out of the teaching, because I'm sure everyone would be uncomfortable to learn how this country, the country we all pledge allegiance to today, consider ourselves citizens of today, how it could so blatantly and so deliberately separate a group of individuals based on the skin of the color of their skin. So I'm gonna take some time to kind of highlight some of these kind of not known stories or pockets of history, and how it kind of all ties to some of the more familiar things that we're used to. Let's see. We have the story of Elizabeth Key, right? Elizabeth Key is this biracial woman from Virginia. And this story is from around like the 1630s. This Elizabeth Key person, her history kind of begins picking up from the 1630s. Now, she was one of the few individuals at this time, the people of color, to have gained her freedom through what they had then called the colonial legal system. Remember, if this is the 1630s, the United States wasn't founded until 1776. So this was, about 140 years before we would have the American Revolution. And during this time, like, black and slave were kind of synonymous. They didn't necessarily mean the same thing, but they were kind of relegated to the same treatment. The black codes, I touched on this a little loosely last week, but in the early 1660s, the black codes were kind of instituted as policy in various states throughout the colonies. But in the 1630s and 1640s, it was real laissez-faire. Like I said, black, slave, it was like, you were looked down upon, but if you were black, you were black. If you were an enslaved person, you were an enslaved person. Well, this lady, Elizabeth Key, her daddy was this white British man. Her mom was a black woman here in America. And, there was a lot of this, the whole mulatto term and class of people came out of the procreation between black and white, right? Let's just call it that. Light-skinned people. But very quickly, and we'll talk about when this all came to be, that light skin still meant Negro. So she was born into this second, class citizen position of a person of color. But her father wanted to make sure she had a quality of life. And so it was this agreement she had that she was going to work as an indentured servant, not as a slave, because remember, this was Virginia and things were a little different in the North. You didn't have these sprawling plantations and whole society built around enslaved people like you did in the South. She was supposed to work until, for about 9 years, until she was like established teenager as an indentured servant. Well, her dad died, and her original handler, the man she was working for, he went back to Britain. And so he passed her over to another gentleman, and they list him as John Moffam. Well, because her father's died, the original agreement isn't held up. Moffam keeps her for another 10 years. So she's in indentured servitude for a total of 19 years. But it left her in this very vulnerable position as a person with no rights. She had no advocate. She had no proof of contract. And so when Moffam died, his heirs, they changed her status from indentured servant to enslaved person. Now, by the time he died, mind you, it's like 1655 that the last person who had a claim on her as an indentured servant, he passes away in the 1650s, right? This is just about a decade shy before these black codes are established throughout all of the colonies. So by this time, all black people were gonna be enslaved people. Now, mind you, Elizabeth is living her life at this point in time. She had become married. She married a white man. She married this white man. What's his name? William. And he becomes a lawyer, right? He was an indentured person, but he ultimately got his freedom. And Elizabeth, she married him. They had a kid together. And this is where the 13th Amendment abolishes both slavery and indentured servitude. Indentured servant meant you were to work for this person based on a clause of some type, right? Whether it's for 9 years, whether it's until you pay back the sum that you owe, or the price of the land that you tried to steal, like whatever circumstance you found yourself in that landed you in indentured servitude, it was just that. It was some type of circumstance. Whereas slaves and enslaved people, well, it didn't matter where you came from, who you are, and what you did. It was based on the fact that you were just property. You belong to someone else. You are no longer a citizen or a human, for that matter, who's eligible for freedom. You are an enslaved person. So when people say white people were slaves too, white people were indentured servants. And this is very, very clear. In the 1660s, this is very, very clear that they were, in the 1600s, indentured servants. Or when you hear people say, well, Africans had slaves too. Africans had warring tribes. And if my tribe beat your tribe, then you all became our indentured servants. But there are records that show even then, I could work my way up through the ranks through my new army. I'm not a slave to these people because I start off as an indentured servant. So that's a key difference there to pay attention to. But the black codes, they established that black skin would be the determinant. So this synonymous nature between black and slave, and they kind of had the same treatment, that was erased. And black and slave kind of meant the same thing. And so in the case of Elizabeth Key, she had her status as an indentured servant downgraded to the status of an enslaved person. And they even did it to her son. Mind you, her son, she was half white and her husband was white, which means her son was only a quarter black. And they added him as an enslaved person as well. And the records say that they did that to increase their property value. Now, mind you, all these facts that I'm giving you are things that I've been kind of studying up on the works of Dr. Clinton Smith, who does a great job of making and modernizing our story and bringing out all of these different legal aspects about how life was structured then. So her husband, like I said, his name was William Grinstead, to be precise. Her and her husband, they took it to the courts. And, the courts first said, well, she's a woman. She doesn't have parents who are married. She's an illegitimate child. She's a byproduct. She has no standing as a citizen. She should be a servant. But her status is a married person. And with her husband, she was able to kind of argue her case. And so she argued that she had the original agreement to only be an indentured servant for 9 years that was manipulated and stretched out further than it should have been. She argued that her dad was white and free. And so therefore, by genetics, she should be free. Right? Made all the logical sense. And she also argued that because she was a Christian woman, because she was a baptized Christian, she could not be enslaved. Now, these things are important because Elizabeth Key would go on to earn her freedom through the legal system, legal system that existed then. The courts ruled in her favor, and her son were free. Now, she's a lucky outlier, but the details about how she was able to use the law, lean on the law, that's a luxury that so many other people of color did not have at this time. The resources that people just did not have. Furthermore, cases like this disrupted the economic reliability of free black labor. We talked about it before. That was the key driver for the continuation of slavery in this country. Cotton becomes king. You start to have a whole region of our country becoming economically dependent on the system of enslaved people. Well, when you have people who can bring up cases in court to get themselves out of this is going to cause way too many waves and hiccups, especially in a nation like we talked about in the beginning of this episode, like a democracy, like the United States, where things must change as the laws change. So this is when slave codes come along. Remember, these slave codes were used as a means to keep enslaved people enslaved forever. And so it was along the 1660s that it was decided that a person's enslaved status would be based upon their mother's status. This allowed white men to rape and impregnate as many black women as they wanted without increasing the population of citizens. They were, in fact, increasing the workforce of the free labor. And they were hit with some kind of fine. The legal writing said if somebody fornicates with a slave person, this was in Virginia, somebody fornicates with an enslaved person and produces a child, they will be taxed twice the amount of the normal penalty for fornication. So, it's just any law with the fine it's just the price you pay for what you want. So, man, you kind of see this as the developing way of life before the colonies became America. It was 13 original colonies. The colonies grew, and in places like Maryland and Virginia, and especially in like South Carolina and throughout the South, laws passed that said like blacks can't testify against white. Black Christians were still enslaved. Because remember, Elizabeth Key, one of the things that she stood on was the fact that she was Christian. And it was a lot of contradiction and peril at that time for a Christian person to be enslaved. You found a lot of justification. We'll talk about that in just a second. A lot of justification. And so when the black codes came along, that stopped that, because now it was a law, everything comes back to law. It was a law that black Christians were still enslaved. The whole societal separation, but beyond the separation, the infringing of our rights. Blacks were not allowed to travel without permission. Blacks weren't allowed to be what's the word I'm looking for? Goodness. Blacks were not allowed to participate in trade. Blacks weren't allowed to have instruments and drums in certain settings, and law enforcement was sanctioned to whip those with disorderly behavior. These were laws that were copied throughout the colony, and a lot of these came from slave rebellions. Make no mistake, they don't teach this in school for a reason. There were plenty of slave rebellions, so much so that they had to create laws to keep people in place and to keep people from organizing and mobilizing and fighting back. There was never a time where our people were not thinking about how to get out of these conditions. But even in places like New York, Rhode Island, Pennsylvania, and in places of the North, there were things like no black gatherings bigger than 3 people, still no trading with blacks, the 9 p.m. curfew for blacks. There was a clear difference in the application of law. A white person could get fined or jailed for an offense that would cost a black person their life. And all of these things that I'm talking about were happening in the late 1600s, early 1700s, 702. And here we are on 22, and you still have this disproportionate application of justice. And so that's why I kind of wanted to get in the corners of how the law was even working back then. You can see in the case of Elizabeth Key, how it was this prevailing system where if you could prove your case, you could find justice. But when the laws are written against you, when the laws are stacked against you, well, it gets back to the messy aspect of our system. And we still have too much biased applications. Think about the officer who just got sentenced 2 years for killing Dante Wright. I don't know if y'all pay attention, but Dante Wright was the young man who was killed last year when this officer said she thought she was pulling out her taser. And she pulled out a gun and killed this man. And she got 2 years. And I like to pay attention to the different sectors, but I caught this on social media. One of the city girls, JT, said, "That's the same time I got for fraud." What is this? What is this system where somebody who takes someone else's life and someone who participates in the illegal access to money is kind of penalized the same way? I don't know. But there are so many people who spend years and years, birthdays, holidays, special days, funeral days, locked behind the wall that are black. So even back then, I say all that to say, even back then, this is when that type of bondage where we can begin to kind of see the formulation of the disproportionate applicant. It's in the laws. And unless we can understand the legal entanglement that we're currently in, unless we can understand the necessary political action and the necessary legal challenges in a proactive manner, not in a reactive manner, nothing against Black Lives Matter, nothing against, those who march and, stand in, with the fallen of these crimes, but we have to become proactive and being able to weaponize the law in our own defense. Organization beyond mobilization, but we'll talk about that another time. But when we do it, that'll be our next monumental gain. That's my opinion. So this is the political hour. I'm Mariel Summers. I have a few more things to talk about. I want to talk about, when we come back, I want to talk about the religious aspect. I said we touch on that a little bit more. I want to talk about the religious aspect and what role that played as all of these laws and systems of egregious inhumanity to other humans, where religion played a role, the American Revolution, and where Black people kind of fit in there. I want to touch on what we did immediately following the American Revolution that put us on this course or discourse for that matter with race relations, and just kind of close out with a little bit of what we can expect going into the 1900s and so forth. So I'm Mariel Summers. Please stay tuned. Enjoy the good tunes. You're listening on Power Plug Radio. There are 5 ways to listen, but please subscribe to the channel, and catch us here every Tuesday evening on The Political Hour.
You're listening to Power Plug Radio, home of your throwback jams. listening to Power Plug Radio, home of your throwback jams.
Welcome back. So, I try and stay mentally focused on, the topics at hand, but I get so excited about presenting this information because it's really the formulation of so much of what we see today. If you missed the first half of the show, be sure to tune in Power Plug Radio on YouTube, subscribe to the channel, go back, rewatch some of the older episodes, and get your political fixing. Get it on. So we talked about, some of the earlier formations of America, some of that maybe not so talked about time, those early 1600s, and how the law, even back then, was the difference maker. It was the determinant in our outcomes. So many of those outcomes that lead to the society that we live in today. So I just kind of want to pick up where we left off. We kind of got all the way up to about the American Revolution, right? We were talking about how, the disproportionate application of the law became common practice. We were talking about how some of these black codes came into being and how, if you were born black, you would be an enslaved person by so many different laws. There's a major contradiction beginning to happen in the United States at this point. We were talking about the early 1700s, but as you know, the United States was founded in 1776. And so here we are in this place in the American colonies where you had groups of all types of conglomerates and religions and thinkers trying to justify the system of enslavement. The institution of slavery was solely based on economics. It was based on free labor, and we were an easy scapegoat. The transatlantic slave trade, the normalcy around the globe during the colonial period, the early colonial period, the early explorations, the conquistadors and so forth, in all of Central and South America, and the exploitation of Aboriginal people from around the globe in the 1600s easily translated to this system of free labor, but it needed some type of moral justification because we are a Judeo-Christian nation. We're founded on the principles of God. The Puritans came over here, and you had the Quakers, right? You had the different religious sects where this was a stark contradiction. And even now, our people still talk about this contradiction. I seen a meme on the internet the other day that says black folks hate everything about slavery but Christianity, right? It serves as this awareness to so many black people who live in the United States today that the system of Christianity was manipulated and worked in the favor of keeping people enslaved. We're talking on the break about some of these things, and here's this book, The Dreaded Comparison, that was brought up. Y'all should take a look and read it. It's a short read, maybe like 100 pages. But out of it, what you get is so much of the record of how our enslavement was justified. It was justified on the principles of scripture. Servants must obey their masters, and we're to have dominion over the earth and all of the animals. And then that's where science would come in, and they would say, well, black people are subspecies, right? These are people who still live in the bushes. Like, these are people whose brains are not the same as the superior species. And this is all debunked science now, right? This is all debunked science. But then And during that time, it was not debunked science. It was the prevailing way of thought at the time. And it stemmed a lot from philosophy and from theory of what a superior species was. I know you all can remember the famous drawing of the man who's all, kind of laid out at all these different dimensions. And so what a man was, and what people use to justify what a black man or a black person were two different things. So we're kind of coming to grips with religion. Many of our parents and our grandparents ingrained this religion into us. And I'm a Christian. I rock my Jesus piece faithfully. I am not denouncing it. But what I'm saying is very early on, we have to be honest, this prevailing religion of the entire nation was weaponized to clear the conscience of the slaveholder and to freely keep the system of enslaving people as a part and a way of life that people could accept. You wonder things like how, fast forward, how could things like the Holocaust happen, right? Well, the Nazis were the prevailing government at the time, and they made laws, and it is amazing what people will do when the law says that they should or should not do it. That's what this all comes back to. We opened up the show talking about how our plight in America, the Black history plight in America, is so entangled with the law that you can't talk about Black history without talking about the law. But as you know, the United States is also a Christian nation. So many people advocated against slavery during the time, and you had some Quakers come out. You had some people come out and say that this is morally wrong. The Georgetown Quakers are perhaps the most noted in history. And this was a small group of individuals who put forth a petition in Virginia area to try and abolish. They were abolitionists. They were like some of the first known abolitionists. And they tried to bring about change through the legal system, through the system of petition to ban slavery. And then it ended up getting kind of like, we'll pass this on to our general monthly meeting. People at general monthly meetings said, we'll pass this on to our annual meeting. The people at the annual meeting took a look at it and said, it's best that we don't meddle in this type of stuff right now. So even those efforts were kind of in a very bureaucratic way quelled down. So fast forward a couple years and we arrive at the American Revolution. I'm sure we all had to study the American Revolution. It's taught to us in such a noble way. It talks about the United States coming to terms that taxation without representation is not how we're going to do this thing. That we are no longer going to be a British colony. That we are going to be an independent nation. It's funny because I can not understand how the contradiction could be so ignored at the time. You see, you had tens, if not hundreds of thousands at this point of Black people in this nation who would continue to live with the highest form of taxation without representation. So it's a very hypocritical time for our nation as we looked to separate and gain our independence and provide freedom for all. But where was the Black person's plight in the American Revolution? Well, you had about 5,000 to 8,000 Black folks, Black men, as troops of the 200,000 recorded American troops during the American Revolution. 8,000 to 5,000 of them were Black. Black people were fighting to gain their freedom. We weren't fighting for a place or for a people. We were fighting for a principle, and that principle was freedom. And so you had those trying to prove their allegiance to the United States. But how about this? You had some 20,000 blacks who fought for the British, because the British seemed more willing to give the emancipation. You had George Washington, the first president. We all know him. He's on the dollar. Black soldiers weren't even allowed to enlist at first. They weren't even allowed to fight on behalf of America at first. But the first black person killed was the first person killed on the side of the Americans. His name was Crispus Attucks. Look him up. Crispus Attucks. That's your Black History fact for the night. Crispus Attucks was the first person killed for the American side during the American Revolution. It happened during the Boston Massacre. And I think it's very telling. We live in this nation where this narrative is on repeat, where our contributions to this nation have no impact, no lasting impact on our freedom. So even then, our role in the revolution, we're fighting for our emancipation. And this is a theme that would reoccur in the Civil War. It's something that happened again in World War I and World War II. The Tuskegee Airmen. Think about I've heard so many frequent stories about the soldiers who were returned from World War II to the South to a segregated society. Had to sit on the back of the bus, got no respect after fighting for this nation. So that's another part of citizenship that, we have to pay attention to. Is even back then, during the American Revolution, black folks were out and being a part of trying to gain our freedom. Yet the U.S., we won the Revolutionary War, and this country reduced us to 3/5 of a person. And I know I'm running low on time, but I'm gonna try and get through this real quick. So the 3/5 compromise and the slave trade clause, those are the last things I want to talk about this week. And I promise you, you say Black History 365, we're gonna live it. I promise you, we'll keep talking about this Black history and death. But understand, we became less free with the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. The Constitution, remember, we talked about it in a few episodes previously. It's the landscape of this nation. It is the Bill of Rights that is the highest law of the land. And you can do whatever you want, state level or at the local level. But if it violates the Constitution, it cannot stand as law. Well, William Lloyd Garrison says that the Constitution was a covenant of death and an agreement with hell. He was an abolitionist as well. But he said that because we could have banned slavery. But instead, we further defined the outlines of it. It was too integral for our economy and our society at that point in 1776 for us to ban slavery. No, it went against the grain. And so Article 1 of the Constitution, even now, in the section that outlines the legislator and how many senators will have, and understand, we talked about House of Representation. It's based on numbers. We have a high population here in Florida, so we're going to have higher representatives than, say, a Georgia or Mississippi or Alabama, because more people live here. Well, during this time, you have a high density of free black people in the North and a low density of high density of free whites in the North, and a low amount of free whites in the South, because you have so many enslaved people. How do you account for these enslaved people if they're not citizens? The 3/5 compromise was born to regulate the math. This is why redistricting is so important. It's why gerrymandering, so that all black people share a representative. We talk about it so often on the show. Michelle Rayner's district stretches over 4 counties, over 4 different black communities. This is a form it achieves the ideas of the 3/5 compromise. All of these people are only going to count for 1 vote. And then there's the slave trade clause, Article 1, Section 9. And it's this provision that prohibited the federal government or any forms of government from putting a number on the amount of imported persons. Right? It doesn't say slaves, but we know who the imported persons are. It did allow room for a tax to be applied, but the slave trade clause was included. So you have the Fugitive Slave Act. You have other acts that happened even before the 1800s began, 1776, and between then and 1800. You'll be able to kind of trace the hand of the United States government in ensuring that black persons were not be considered citizens. So look, this is your political hour. I'm well over my time, but boy, do I enjoy talking about this stuff. I'm going to come back next week. I want to touch more on what's happening right now. Hopefully we'll have more news coming from the legislature, and we won't be in World War III, and our mayor here will have gotten some more, notable things, celebratory things accomplished. But I'm Marielle Summers. You can find me here Tuesday night, 7 o'clock, Power Plug Radio. Thank you for tuning in to the Political Hour.
You're listening to Power Plug Radio, home of your throwback jams.